My name is Jacob. Boss is my surname, and I've been working with People Tree Press for almost 12 years now. I didn't realize that. I thought in fact, it really, when I look back, and it's really struck me. I thought it was probably around 5 or 6, but I don't always have a good sense of time and timing. So that one kind of made me sit up straight. And I've been working as a associate fiction editor with People Tree for, it's over a decade now, as I just indicated, more than a decade. I don't remember the details and stuff. I think it was a sort of mutual agreement on and understanding, because People Tree is a very particular kind of press. It's a special press, as you know, that specializes in literature or literatures from the Caribbean and the wider sort of post-colonial diaspora, which requires a certain, and as you know, we choose, very, very, very good books. We choose books which, help us and has helped us over the years to punch above our weight as a small publisher, because it boils down to just 4 or 5 people who are working there, but we have the profile that is quite enviable, we stand up to some of the biggest publishers in the world in terms of the quality of the work that we produce. And what that requires, in fact, is a certain kind of scrutiny of the work that come in, backed by a massive sort of, I would say a massive context. I mean, almost like, a knowledge of writing from that part of the world. And I think, and Jeremy is extremely good at that. I've learned a lot from working with Jeremy Pointing, the managing editor, because one of the things that we do and probably enjoy most is just discussing literature, looking at trends, spotting trends, identifying the books that we receive through submittable, as important, having a sense of which gaps they fill in terms of the broader Caribbean narrative and the broader post-colonial narrative, or indeed the colonial narrative. And of course, it's the criteria are very, very strict, very rigid. They have to be good books by writers who have something to say. So we sort of kindred spirits in that sense. We both have that connection with the literature, that commitment to the literature, and dare I say, that understanding of the literature, not only as a book, which is an artifact, a solid object, but the context that that book fits into, and how that book is in conversation with other books that have come before, So that's largely, and that's one of the great attractions, the great seductions, if you like, of working with People Tree Press, working with Jeremy Pointing and Hannah and you, Rowan, and Lucy and Adam and Paulette. I can go on forever.
Before I ask you a few more questions about your role as associate editor, you mentioned scrutiny of work. I'd like us to sort of hone in on that. How did you come by People Tree Press? People Tree Press's ethos, as you just described, is about, People Tree has for decades now. It's the 40th anniversary next year.
Yes.
Excuse me. Has created and bridged these transnational gaps between the Caribbean and the UK, particularly in the publishing sector. Yeah, could you share how you came across the press?
Yes, well, that's interesting. I mean, I used to work as the editor of a big intercultural arts magazine. You know, we covered everything from fine arts to theater through to, yeah. The magazine was called Art Rage, and that was in the um in the 90s in particular. And it was a very, very important magazine in my field. It was an archive, and there are people who have full sets of it, and it's an archive of the time, the mid 90s, the end of the all the way up to early 2000s, and that magazine, um it died during the time of Margaret Thatcher, when they were cutting back everything. And as a matter of fact, that was a period when they decimated the Black arts sector, because there was a thing called the Black arts sector in this country. Artists from all over the world, all over the diaspora. Some of the great groups that we may or may not know of, like African Dawn, so many of them, were doing performances, and it was absolutely important at the time, because it helped create and sustain a kind of fabric. And I came out of that context, at least my sensibility in Britain, because I arrived here as what some people would quite happily call now a migrant. It's too late for them to put illegal to it, but I'm sure if I had come a bit later on in these times, I would have been probably seen as an illegal immigrant, even though I came by plane or something. And because I was editing this magazine, I came upon People Tree Press because their books, we listed their books, we had their books reviewed, and it was a much sought after paper, because the audience went beyond just the kind of Black intelligentsia. It was read across the board. It was seen as an important magazine in its time. So I did get a very good sense of the quality of the work that was being produced. And I didn't know much about them, apart from the fact that, they sent really good books, and almost every book they sent for review. And I was one who kind of, as editor, would, identify which journalist I wanted to interview the authors and stuff. That's when I realized that this is a small press. They're out there, but they're doing pretty amazing things. So I began to get a very strong sense of what they were, what they were about. And they were just there in the background. And I was busy doing other things, working as a journalist and doing all kinds of stuff at the time. But then eventually, I think it was through Khadija Sesi, who I don't know exactly, I don't remember the details of it, but it's kind of through her. Jeremy got in touch with me, or we got in touch with each other. And my interview was a wonderful evening spent in his amazing little house, just talking literature. And at the end of it, I had a job, basically, you know. And I suppose, he wanted to suss me out and see probably, where I'm coming from, what my, and that was 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And I'm still there. I do other things. I teach narrative craft very seriously at all levels, from postgraduate all the way to community. Um, I write, as you know, and so I do lots of other things, and which is what I like about the job also. Um, it allows me to pursue other areas of my life. It's flexible. It's a lot of understanding, you know. There's a lot of value in the kind of interactions that I have with people, with Jeremy, and so on. It's good.
Mm. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned migrating to Britain. Where did you migrate from? I already
I'm
know
a,
this answer, and
I'm a, Yeah, it's a story of my life. I migrated from Grenada, which is where I was born and grew up. I was in my mid-20s when I came to Britain, and I didn't come to Britain because I loved the country and I had all this kind of attachment with the empire. To be honest with you, I came to Britain, but for two reasons. Um, One of them was I came to Britain in 1984, and anybody who knows anything about the history of Grenada would remember that Grenada was invaded by the American military in 1983, and that's a whole story. Um, and I was so affected by it. I was so enraged by it. I was felt so. It was. I mean, for me, it was a profound experience, almost psychic in its in terms of the way it shook me up. And I came here because I was advised by somebody, who was part of that whole apparatus that invaded the country, that it's best if I left the country. And I did. I came here. I came here because I had a girlfriend here whom I eventually married, you know. And I'm still here. I go back. But my mission was to write the book about that experience. It's the most difficult undertaking. And some time ago, I was really ill as a result of COVID, and I thought, that look, I would not be able to make it. And the only thing that sat on my mind, apart from my children and my three children, was the fact that I wouldn't be able to finish that book, and it probably kept me alive, you know, because for me, it's the most important project that I have, but it's a very, very difficult experience to revisit. And it's 40 years now. I've written first and second drafts. I'm on my third draft of it, and I've grown as a writer. So, and that growth, of course, would be definitely reflected in my book. And since then, I've had the opportunity to meditate on war, to think about war, human nature, to think about, and to think about our history, to think about cruelty, think about impositions of peoples, nations, races on each other, Um, so, and that I think will in some oblique way inform the book. But that's the reason why one of the two reasons why I came here, as a kind of self-imposed exile. I don't want it to sound too romantic because it didn't, I was too annoyed and too upset to even think of it as exile. But I stayed away from Grenada for 10 years before I even made contact again. And I paid the price because my family wasn't very forgiving when I returned. They said, where the hell were you? It was a hard time. Very, very, very difficult, but I just couldn't face it.
Mm.
Facing Grenada was facing the memory and facing the history.
You were a bit of a political activist in Grenada. Could you share maybe some basic history on Grenada?
Yeah. Grenada was it's a relatively small island in the Eastern Caribbean. Um, it's 133 square miles. The population now it kind of wavers between, I would say, 100 and 110,000. Um, and it stays static for a very long time because, people have children, but, the population remains the same. And that's largely because people migrate, people, especially to North America and so on. Um, and the Europeans first caught sight of it. I can't remember the date, but it was cited, but it was never, nobody ever, they didn't set their foot on it, on the island. And that's one of the distinguishing things about Grenada. It took 100 years for the Europeans, even though they knew of its existence, it took 100 years before they set foot on the island. And within 60 years, maybe less, of the Europeans, stepping on to the island, the indigenous population was a beautiful people. In fact, there was several nation groups, several indigenous nation groups. There were the Kalinagos. There was a special group called the Kalivini people who lived in the area where I grew up, and they were decimated. The French, there's a guy called Duparquet. They just totally killed them. And there is an apocryphal. It was not apocryphal. It's that really happened. A story about this guy. He was a chief. This man. He was the chief of the people of the island. Um, he fought the French from the south of the island all the way up to the north. And there's a precipice that overlooks the sea. We call it Leapers Hill. The French call it sauteurs, which like sauteur, sauter is to jump in French. And he slaughtered his children, they slaughtered the women, threw them over the precipice, and he stood with the rest of the men, and they just fought to the death, and the rest of them just leapt over the precipice. So it's quite a seminal narrative in our heads, it's something we grew up and we learned about. And it has done, I believe, something to the Grenadian personality, the national kind of persona. Um, yeah. And subsequent to that, it changed hands a couple of times between the French and the English. They fought over it until they had a treaty, whose name I can't remember. They had a 10-day war. And it changed hands. First, it was in the hands of the French, and part of they had a deal because for them, these islands were real estate, and as far as they were concerned, it's a bit like what happened with the Aborigines in Australia. You enter into a land, you see people there, but then you declare it as being without people. Why? Because of course they're not seen as humans, they're seen as animals or seen as wildlife. And that happened also in a lot of the Caribbean with the indigenous people, which they were all wiped out. They have remnants of them in Dominica. And uh, the Garifuna people, for example, in Belize, they all mixed. And of course, Grenada became part of the British imperial projects. It was a slave plantation, basically, the whole island was, yes. And a lot of people made their fortunes. A lot of Europeans made their fortunes off the backs of our people, our ancestors. In fact, my name is Jacob Ross. Ross is a Scottish name. And there's a plant, I can point to the plantation where this guy called John Ross, he's a Scottish guy, John Ross, that he owned. I can point to even in my lineage, I have a great, great, great grandmother who was biracial, she was John Ross's concubine. Um, so yeah, and that's a history. And of course, then 1795, a major war between a local guy called Junior Fedon. Fedon was he was also biracial, French. His allegiance was to the French, and they resented very strongly the British taking ownership of the island in this treaty which I mentioned earlier. And Fedon decided he was going to fight against the British. And that war lasted 1 year, and he would have won it. But he didn't win it because he didn't, basic military strategy is you besiege the capital. If you get control of the capital, that's a major, and he didn't manage to do that. And that's Julian Fedon. And to this day they don't know. He was not captured. 1950s was very important because I don't know if you ever heard about the Moynihan Report. That was in the 1930s, which was a report done on the conditions and circumstances of Black people in the Caribbean after quote unquote emancipation. And in fact, it was so explosive and so condemnatory. The British government decided that they were going to suppress it until after Second World War. That report came out relatively recently, but it there were photographs even, of the condition people were living in, the way they were, and basically these islands were left on their knees. I'm not going to talk about reparations, but because that's a massive subject and so, but if you saw how people lived, and a legacy which hasn't gone away. That's what people have this idea of history as something that the English love to do that. The British love to oh, that happened a long time ago and I'm not responsible. It is a height of stupidity. It's a height, it's just it's a deliberate kind of myopia. It's a self-imposed myopia, and not, whereas on the one hand you would tell me about the legacy of Shakespeare, the Doomsday Book, which go back even further than that, and the extent to which it has become part of the national identity. And yet, you tell me slavery happened just, a few days, a few hundred years ago, and you had nothing to do with it. When these countries have become what they have become precisely because of that terrible experience. But anyway, in the 1950s, something quite interesting happened, which was to do with a lot of the Caribbean people, predominantly Caribbean males. They left these islands to go to work, for example, building the Panama Canal. Some of them came to Britain to work, as you well know, after the Second World War. Some of them went off to work in the orange fields in California and so on. Some of them went to Aruba because there was an oil refinery there. The point is that mass movement of men, predominantly men, very few women, because it was, who went up there. Many of them died. Olive Senior has written a book. I think it's called Dying to Better Themselves. This book written by Olive Senior. It's a very interesting book, very important book. And she explores that in this very important book that she's done, Olive Senior. Point is that many of them, for the first time, began to experience organized labor and the benefits of organized labor. In other words, trade unionism, which is why so many of the Caribbean islands and so many of the Caribbean political parties actually came out of trade unions. And in my country, certainly was the case. Many of the early prime ministers were trade unionists. It came back and so on, and that was part of the fight against the British Empire, or the remnants of the British Empire. A lot of the ideologies of organized labor, and the British fought them back. Some of them were jailed, like our first prime minister. Some of them were jailed. They were, oh my God, serious repression happened during the 1950s and stuff, until eventually Britain, not being a world power anymore and not being able to sustain it, didn't give us our independence. For me, in my view, it was a kind of relinquishing, because they couldn't hold on. They had to relinquish all of these countries. And it's very interesting that most of it happened just subsequent to the Second World War, when this country was at its weakest. And the whole slew of them, from the 1960s all the way up, they became crown colonies and later on became whatever. The point is that Grenada has had that history, the history of the colonial history, the history of the colonialism, the history of the Caribbean. Grenada's story is part of that big story too. And there's some important distinguishing things that happened during the time. And I was highly politicized, yes, because the guy who literally led our country towards independence, he became a dictator. That's where my writing really began, where I, as a young boy, I must have been about 14 at the time, I began to understand that the world is not as I've been told it is, that there are forces out there that you can be killed for your ideas, put it that way. You can be jailed for it, you can be beaten for your ideas, for belief, and that me coming from a very poor background at the time, my father was he was many things, but he was a farmer too. Apart from being, other stuff. So, and in the 19, so we fought against, I was highly political. I was in school, secondary school at the time. And yeah, I was part of the student movement that fought, because most political movements in my country, especially the modern political movements, have their roots in the schools, secondary schools, you know, which is an interesting feature of Grenada. Most of the seeds of, I suppose it happens in other countries where, universities are known and notorious for the kind of fomenting, but we don't have a university in Grenada. So secondary schools, we read stuff, we were introduced to Malcolm X and, the civil rights movement later on, all of that stuff made infusions into our outlook and our brains. And so, and we had a dictator, man, he was terrible. I experienced him personally, as everybody else, my generation. And we began to fight against him. But it led to to a coup, basically, which is to do with the young men, my contemporaries, realized that they had to take over the country, largely because the prime minister at the time left the island. And whenever he leaves the island, he always leaves instructions with his secret police. We used to call them the Mongoose Gang, the equivalent of Haiti's Tonton Macoute or whatever, to eliminate, these young men who were giving him so much trouble. And there was a coup in 1979. And the island went down a socialist path because the only country that was prepared to embrace them were countries like Cuba and so on and so forth. And basically, this island got caught up, Grenada got caught up in the whole Cold War thing. And the Americans didn't like it one bit, even though many overtures were made to kind of explain why we had to do this as far as they were concerned, especially during Reagan's time. They're all communist, and the word communist is a red flag for most Americans, as you know, especially American when you say communist, something happens in the brain, So, and I was away studying at the time, but I returned to Grenada to work in the government. And in 1979, that government was still in 1983, that government was still existing. Actually, was existing, and I was part of that whole thing. But they began to fight between each other, and they had a terrible kind of. It was awful what happened there. The prime minister ended up being killed, and about 7 other colleagues ended up being killed, and was a wonderful excuse for the Americans to invade. Actually, they invaded the island. The invasion happened in 1983. And I arrived here in 1984. So now you understand. And I arrived with this sense of outrage and whatever else. And I came and I decided to write a book about that experience, because the thing about it is that these stories, put it this way, the antelope never gets to tell its story because it's the lion that tells the story. You know that proverb, right? And I was the antelope, and I said, "Well, I'm going to tell the story, as seen from from the perspective of somebody experiencing that, as opposed to somebody imposing war, somebody experiencing. I suppose if you look at what's happening in the Middle East now, or probably in Eastern Europe, the stories that the aggressors would tell would never, for the same incidents, would never be the same that the victims of that aggression be able to tell. It's as simple as that. And that book I've been struggling with for years, you know.
Thank you for that history, Jacob. Much of it like I didn't even know. So thank you for the context. You studied in France, and I wanted to ask you whether the body of literature you were exposed to in Grenada in your secondary schooling was different to the literature that you came by in France.
Yeah, I mean, the literary study in France, we had a thoroughly, colonial education. I mean, most um people of my generation would have been more familiar with the seasons of England, summer, autumn, winter, spring, than they would be with the seasons in the Caribbean. I mean, most Caribbean people still think that we have two seasons, the dry season and the rainy season, but we don't. I mean, as a writer, somebody who observed, I can feel the change of seasons. Right? Christmas is a kind of winter because it gets cold around the time. You know what I mean? So it's all no, anyway. Um, I once I became a writer and decided to use my country, my island as the setting, I literally used to phone home, phone my relative and my friend, and ask them for the names of plants and flowers because I was more familiar with names that with daisies and daffodils and tulips than I was with local plants. So I had to ask local, and that is to do with my education too. Because education is a kind of not only is it's a kind of inculcation, it's a kind of brainwashing to put it, blunt, the one that we had, where for example, you know, couldn't be caught speaking the Grenadian language, the Grenadian Creole in school. I had to speak standard English. So, and we read the usual stuff, some of it designed for the Caribbean, we had a series of books called the Royal Readers. Royal Readers, check it out, you know, and all the narratives in there. If you deconstruct that now, and people still remember it to a certain degree, reconstruct that, it was a serious attempt at making intellectual servants, or of the colonial powers, the way we are shaped, the rich man at his castle, the poor man at his gate, you know, basically, that's his estate and whatever, that kind of inculcation and stuff. But we rose out of that. We kind of emerged out of that, especially with the triggering, um, you know, events like, as I said, I mentioned, and that was largely in secondary school, the civil rights movement in America, very profoundly affecting and stuff. And the music, the rebel music that came out of America, Curtis Mayfield, and then of course the Jamaicans were way ahead of us in terms of their own rebel culture, which is reggae. Reggae is rebel, as you know. And all of that was part of our education too. In France, um, they tried to do a similar thing in France because they had a thing called la civilisation française, French civilization. That's a subject, French civilization. And and that was a requirement for people like, be the new arrivants, They give unless you came straight into, I don't know, maybe it's changed now, but you had a course called La Civilisation Française, French civilization. Um, and that again was part of the whole, and the French are very successful colonizers, as we know, because they go for the psychology of people, they go for the brain. No wonder, yeah, Martinique and Guadeloupe are still colonies of France, you know what I mean? French are very good at tying you down, mentally and psychologically. Anyway, point is, but then I got into the mainstream, study, and um it was also a very enlightening experience because that is where I studied linguistics, and in particular Creole linguistics. And that, was, um, the kind of in-depth study of how Caribbean people spoke, why we spoke the way we spoke, what was happening at the level of language, the mechanism of the language, why it evolved the way it did, its social and historical context, and that was a kind of radicalization, through study. Um, and recognizing that the thing that I learned when I was in school, to be ashamed of the way I spoke, was completely debunked by my understanding of, Caribbean Creoles, its inventiveness, its beauty, and that it had a grammar, it had a morphology, it had a syntax, it had all of the elements, and was no less or greater than any other language. That it did what languages do, what languages are meant to do. It conveyed meaning, either by silences, by innuendos, by implicatio, by whatever, that 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 it had and all the sophistications that you would find, for example, in a so-called major language, European language. You did the same thing in Creole. And of course, later on, we saw what some of the great poets like Derek Walcott and Edward Cameron Braithwaite and all of these other writers, and the fiction writers like Lovelace and all of these writers do. We take it for granted now, Sam Selvon, we saw how the inventiveness with which they deployed this language, and that it became a living thing and became recognized for what it was, you know. So I learned that and I also learned a certain kind of approach to writing when I was in France. There's a writer whose name I don't remember now because it was the first book I read completely in French, like from page 1 to page 300 in French. And it was slow going because, I thought I was fluent in the language until I arrived there. That's when I realized that I didn't know a thing. Uh, and it was a writer who taught me, along with Walcott, taught me about the magic of place, landscape, and how landscape is not just, the place that you see, but experience shaped landscape, memory shaped landscape. That landscape is a living thing, and how, in fact, the topography of one's surroundings actually have a profound impact on the culture and the life and, the way people the way people occupy space. I mean, I'll give you a really interesting example. I had a friend. He was a leading Cuban choreographer. His name was Eduardo Rivero Walker. He had Jamaican roots. He was a fantastic, and his legacy is still there because the National Dance Theatre Company of Jamaica still do one of his choreographies. It's a piece called Sulkari. But what he showed, he showed me was he took me to a place and he, I never knew this. Choreographers have a way of they can annotate, the way people move. Yeah, they can do that. And I first time I ever saw it. And because he was trying to create a dance or create a dance suite that was very specific to the island, Grenada, where he was, which was where I met him at the time. And he went to the marketplace, and I will never forget this, and it's a very hilly island. And he was looking at women and men walking. And he said to me, look, I have been through so much of the Caribbean, and one of the things I found is that the people of the hill country, the hills of these islands, people who live on the hills, they have a very different way of walking. you know. He said you will notice the way the hips roll, the women and the men, and that's because, and it comes from climbing hills. It comes from climbing hills, moving up and down hills. The body adjusts to that, and so he showed me. He said, for example, I can tell you that that person here, lives or has lived for a very long time in the hills or the mount, on slopes because of the way their body moves, the way their hips, the way they adjust to. It was incredible. and that was one of the great insights of my life. You know, that you know, the way topography shaped culture, and you know, now I mean, of course, we all do it. You know, you people talk a lot about it because, you know, they have a kind of, you know, talk about the writing of place and ecological writing and all that kind of stuff. But
How soon did you begin writing? Was it immediate or was it a process?
writing when I was 14. Um, I mean, and if you look at my collection of short stories, some of those short stories I wrote when I was in secondary school. People, you can't see the difference because, you know, I had a very good editor in Jeremy, and also because, I mean, I wouldn't say I was fully formed, but I read voraciously because that's all I had to escape, you know, escape the world, escape that I lived in. You know, you tend to you know, it's not by chance. If you look at it, the kind of childhood of many writers, you know, it's very often you know, they from childhood they're quite isolated, and they find a certain kind of comfort, if you like, or escape in reading. So many writers have that backstory, you know. Um, and that's what I did, you know. A lot of what I did at that time was just to read, and reading is a kind of integration happens when you read. You know, it becomes what you read, you visualize. It becomes embedded in the imagination. It becomes embedded in your psyche, and so that sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish the world that you're living in and the world that is in your head. And sometimes you actually prefer the world in your head, the world of your book, than of the real world, especially if the real world is harsh. So, um, and I was quite. I mean, in those days, you know, the word you would use now is precocious. I wasn't. My father was the one who taught me to read. Because I spent a lot of time with him, and he taught me to read from very young. In fact, when I first went to primary school, they didn't know what the hell to do with me, you know, because you know, I was reading about quite a few years ahead of my father loved all these big words and complex syntax, so you know, and I just imitated him. Anyway, leaving that aside, I came to it very early. Um, I came to writing very early, but I wasn't writing with an intention or desire to be a writer. I wrote because it's something I replicated stories, I invented stories because storying was a thing that I gained a lot of pleasure from. And I know my family, my brothers and sisters, they used to love to hear me invent stuff, and I would just invent stories about them sometimes, you know. And then they know it's fiction, but you know, they love the kind of stuff I did. And also with my children, I did that with my kids too. You know, they would just sit there telling me a story, and I had to make up one on the spot. So, you know, they will tell you, they will speak of that, I'm sure. Even someday, at some point in my life, at the end of life, they'll talk about dad telling them stories, you know, making stories up. Still love it.
So I guess writing was almost like a catharsis for you.
It was yeah, it was therapy, it was catharsis, it was escape, you know, yeah, and also it was a way of making sense of a relatively chaotic world, which is what writing does. Writing attempts to make sense of, you know, of chaos, you know, of it tries to make the incomprehensible comprehensible. Yeah, it tries to writing is a kind of unraveling, certainly from the writer's point of view, you know. Um, and that's what writing, yeah, was to me. That's what it did for me.
What's the main genre of your writing? Or rather, how did you break into writing crime novels?
Oh, there's a real story behind that. Um, my main genre, I always saw myself as a literary writer. always did, and I began by writing poetry, then I moved to short stories, and then crime was a fluke, basically. It's and that there are several narratives around it, but I mean, People Troopers had a lot to do with it because I wouldn't have done one probably, or would have done one much later in life. And I didn't read a lot of crime fiction in my time. Um, but I remember I was teaching um an aspect of writing which I call understructure, narrative understructure. In other words, a kind of basic three-beat narrative that's stories universally or generally sit on, you know. And they have different names for it, but I was, I kind of just told them in my enthusiasm to get that class I was teaching to absorb the point I was making. I said, once you understand how stories work in terms of its understructure, you can write anything. You can write any genre. You can write crime. And somebody, I remember a woman in class whom I liked a lot, a good, I won't call her name. She just said, yeah, right, in this very sarcastic, cynical way, as if I'm talking nonsense. So, and she challenged me, she said, you can't write, you can't, you don't tell me that this can make you or help you write um a crime novel or what a historical novel. I don't see how it works. I said, okay, I'll show you one day. And I left it like that. And then I went to the Caribbean, and I was there for a little while, a few weeks, and I just started writing, you know. This thing which was meant to be a children's story, or young adult thing. And it gradually evolved into, then I had about 15,000 words. And I sent it to Jeremy. I said, Jeremy, look, are you going to publish this when I finish with it? It's just I can add another 10,000 words or 20,000 words. And he wrote me back almost immediately and said to me, this is a novel, Jacob, and it's a good one. I want it, which committed me to writing it, of course, writing it. And that's how it happened, the crime novel. And the rest is history. It went on to win Jhalak Prize and this prize and that sort of accolade and stuff. But so Jeremy was the one who kind of confirmed me in my arrogance that I could write a crime novel, you know, not having had any previous experience of the genre. But it's taught me a lot, and I've grown to respect it enormously as a genre. And if you read you can read my crime novels as a crime novel or as a piece of or as literary fiction, because it draws very heavily on literary techniques. You know, I spend time on my characters. I plumb their psychology and their motivations. And I offer up a language which is quite considered. Your average reader has a sense that it's not written in a slapdash manner at all. I take time, over the crafting of the narrative. Um, and it's usually referred to as literary crime. So it's literary. I would say my my proclivity, my tendency, where writing is concerned, is essentially literary. That's because of what I consumed, when I was growing up. And I was a reader, not because I have any innate talent at all for it. It's just because it's something I grew to absorb, to understand, to have a sense of the shape, of and what's required to write that kind of book.
Mm-mm. You wanted to circle back to the beginning because you mentioned as an editor or working as an editor involves scrutinizing work. Do you find that you scrutinize your own writing, or are you Jacob Ross the writer and Jacob Ross the associate editor, or do they merge in some
They
places?
merge. They merge. I edit while I write. In fact, touch wood, I've never had a book. Um, I've never had a book that that's had to be heavily edited by an editor, especially my novels. For my short stories and stuff, you know, it, it does get edited, you know. And one of the finest editors that I have ever worked with is Jeremy. Jeremy he just got an eye for. He's very meticulous, you know. He's brilliant, and you know, I don't know if he knows it. I keep saying it to him, but it's almost as if he never hears me when I say it. But he is absolutely such a fantastic editor. But not structural stuff. You know, you wouldn't find any editor coming back to me and saying, well, you know, this needs to happen or this needs to be moved there or that and the other, because I bring that sort of experience, if you like. I've been doing this for more than 30 years, editing. You know, I literally since my insertion in this country here, I've always edited, you know. I've always done that work. I've always been a teacher, a tutor, and an editor. The principal thing, and I would say a writer too. These are the three big things I do. So, um, and I am as a matter of fact, it's not always an advantage, not always an advantage to be that fussy about one's own writing, because there are good editors who at times, you know, one of my really good friends always used to in the early days always say to me, man, just hand over the bloody manuscript, because, you know, let the editor handle that stuff, because, you know, they thought that it took too much time between books. And that's true. Yes, it takes a lot of time between books. And I understood this because me being so, you know, whatever, fussy about what I put out. So it's not always an advantage. You know, and I know quite a few very, very good writers whom I respect, who would just, they would write it, you know, bring it up to a certain level, and then the rest the editor does, which is good practice, you know, I think.
Wanted to ask you about your role as an editor and how you are able to enhance that craft. You know, is there a direct correlation between the reading that you did growing up and the reading that you continue to do, and editing?
It's part of it is my education, you know, a kind of deep dive into language and language mechanics. Um, Part of it is comes from, you know, the reading, so you know, um, part of it comes from the writing, because writing, as a writer, I have to know what a good story is and how to address a good story. I mean, different writers bring their own personalities, idiosyncrasies, dispositions towards it, but a good story is a good story. You know, a strong story is a strong story. Then, of course, there's a whole area, and that comes from my teaching, which is to the understanding how and why stories work. You know, the mechanics of story. And it's not a make-up thing. There's some people who have it naturally. It's a gift. They just use it. But more and more, especially now in the West, and you know, and take what I mean by that. Writing has become much more consciously a craft. People do amazing the thing. You know, they are, you know, they do all that kind of, you know, stuff, and they bring all kinds of concepts to it, you know, liminality and you name it, you know. So that it's far more competitive. And I think that there's a certain kind of and because there's so many people doing it now, you know, you have to know what you're doing, you know, basically. And a book takes roughly around 18 months to 2 years to write, if you're writing it, you know, at a very, very fast, you know, you're committed to it. And that's a lot, that's 2 years of your life. You can't retrieve it. So, so all of these flow into the practice itself of editing. And then you learn some of the common, you know, mistakes or problems with writing. Sometimes a writer is writing, and one of the things you do as an editor is, and you know, and the more you do it, the better you get at it, which is to do with understanding what the writer is trying to say, you know, by the phrase they've used, or by the, and thinking also about whether or not the reader would understand this, you know. What are the elements that get in the way of the purity of the communication between the writer and the right, and all of that stuff, all the stuff which are extraneous, they go. You know, you just stop. You know, you excite. Some writers fight you, and some writers don't want you to touch a comma, but that's not the kind of writer that that you want to work with. You know, it has to be a certain degree of understanding and collaboration between editor and writer. There has to be trust. That's a really, and no two editors editing the same way. You know, give two editors the same manuscript, and you end up with two very differently edited books. You know, because what you bring to a book also as an editor, perhaps, is your own story. Why do editors like some editors? You know, they'll die for a book. You know, and another editor will just say, well, you know, that book doesn't speak to me. So it's quite subjective too. Um, but there's also an element of objectivity, because it's being able to recognize a story that is a good story, it resonates, that a writer may be clumsy occasionally, but what the writer is getting at is profound, or it's interesting, it's worth, you know, it's worth working on. And I know I'm not giving you a technical answer to the question, but you know, you look for repetitions, tautology, extraneous phrases. You look for what I call summarized paragraphs. There's so much you're looking for. It's like conducting an orchestra. Writing is like conducting an orchestra, because there's so many things that, you know, come, some of them unconscious. But editing also is like conducting an orchestra. It's like you have a sense, you need to have a sense of the whole book, the book as a unit, and how it fits together. And, you know, you have to look for timeline, you look for the arc of the book, you know. There's a lot that, you know, the very architecture of the book, you know, you need to have a sense of that. You have to look at what your characters are doing, and whether or not they are represented on the page, or indeed whether or not you, the writer, some writers tend to do a lot, including me, whether or not by including a certain scene, you know, the writer is actually undermining the characters. You know, the writer wants to give you a sense of a character who has great resilience and strength and courage, you know. But somewhere along the line, you have this character whimpering, or, you know, doing something that points to a certain kind of, you know, a certain kind of weakness, or certain kind of, you know. So I don't know, it's a difficult thing to explain, because sometimes the whimpering is quite adequate, but and it could be right for the book, but sometimes you look for the ways in which the writer might be undermining the characters, you know. I have really good examples of that for my last book, where I had my character Digger do something to his girlfriend, you know, scare the hell out of her, but what came up was a certain kind of cruelty. It was very cruel. And the editor says to me, but once you do that, you change him. He's a nice guy. You know, that's the way he presents him. He's not a gentleman, but he's not a bad man. You know, he's sensitive to, you know, to women. He likes women, you know. And there are many men who don't like women in fiction. You know, they come across as being in love, but they don't. But he genuinely likes women, you know, he likes the women, you know. So, and in a way that is quite healthy, you know, it's not, um, and that was my intention. And you can undermine that by just creating a scene where they do something which doesn't conform to one's idea of the character. That's the point I was making. Mhm.
Oh, thank you for that answer. Could you talk a little bit about the readers and writers group that you facilitate? Some background, how regularly you meet, and I guess the different roles that
Yeah.
you play, or you know,
Yeah,
Jacob Ross teacher, Jacob Ross
yeah,
writer, and Jacob Ross
yeah,
editor.
yeah. Um, but it's a group I inherited. I mean, the Readers and Writers group um have, and and it wasn't my idea. It was, I think it must have, it's People Troopers' idea, put it this way, to bring together a group of people from the community, you know, from Leeds, basically, from Leeds community, and just open out the space to them, offer them a space where they can come and they can talk about books, you know, so that hence readers and writers. And they were largely, I would suggest they were largely readers. You know, they would come, they would get a people tree book, you know, and they, you know, have discussions on it and run discussions on it. When I was brought in, which is a little while back, um, not long after I kind of joined People Tree Press, I was asked to run workshops with them. So then, you know, introduce introducing them to writing. And I think that that's it's from that point onwards that they really became a readers and writers group, because you know we had them writing now in addition to that. And it was astonishing because um in terms of the demographics, you had one person, she was in her 80s, for example, and you had another person who was about 18 or 17. So it's, you know, predominantly women, but which is common in narrative creative writing courses, narrative craft. So I would bring, you know, we would bring text to them. I did a lot of these in the early days, but to a lesser extent now. And then, you know, I'd get them writing exercises, or we sometimes we just discuss a piece of text, you know, which is a way of getting them to understand how certain kinds of narratives or stories work. And as time passed, I think it was um I think it was Hannah who suggested an anthology of the work, which was fantastic because what it meant is that we have something to work towards. Yeah. So you know, we throw out and that's where Khadija Abraham, she's a kind of course administrator and convener and stuff, you know, she does a lot of that. You know, we would came up with a title, and the first one was just weighted words, which we gave them the prerogative to come up with a name for it. Never again. It takes too long and too many disagreements. In future, I don't think it'll happen. In future, one of us, you know, and we take that over. So yeah, and that's how it was. And they were the first one was to just work to a theme, weighted words, you know, words with weight. And it was amazing because by the time that anthology came out, they really began to spread their wings, man. You know, you had people, one of them that one of and she's the eldest in the group, the oldest in the group. She wrote her memoir. In fact, she's written two memoirs. Yes. Um, and I'm talking about well-received memoirs. We had one who published a book, her book of a collection of poetry, which is very good. People Tree Press published it. Many of them have gone on to win competitions and submit the stuff online, you know, and that came out of, some of them are even teaching now, you know, narrative craft. The academic background range, there were a couple of them who were doing PhDs. There were a couple of them who just didn't have the time or disposition to, you know, all kinds of, you know, a whole range of, it's a salad of people, you know. What they all have in common is that they're just lovely people to work with. Um, so some of them have become seasoned writers. Some of them have become major, has been merged from that group into national writers, you know. Um, and that just began as as I said, just a group of people. So, and we did the last anthology, and we were meant to publish it and just hand it over to them. So if you know, we have 30 people in it, we printed 30 books, maybe 40 books, and give each one. But it was so well received It's now on Amazon, you know. And then subsequently, the next one, we thought that that's a good formula, having people working towards, and it's very demanding, you know, um, because it's not because they are quote unquote community writers that they would give you, stuff that isn't good. So it would take, so I'd have a series of one-to-one workshops over a long period with them, some a year and a half, just working on their piece with them, refining it with them until they got to a point where, they have work that is publishable and enjoyable by readers coming from any kind of space. So, just working on the craft and the. And stuff. So we move from a group that read, text and commented on it, to a group that became quite goal orientated, with a view to arriving after a certain amount of work at producing a publication. So the last one we produced is one called Sanctuary. And each one should, in my head, represent an improvement on the other, so you see the writers beginning to innovate, beginning to do experimental and very interesting things, that the quality of the work improves all the time. And I think that we have achieved that, or we are achieving that. Some of them will no longer even be interested in a group like ours, because they would have grown past it, which is what we want. They would be producing their own stuff and being out there talking about their work, sharing their work with the public, publishing their work, and it's already happening.
Wow, so there's that writer development aspect.
It's essentially a developmental program, and it's open to anybody in this region, Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, wherever you come from, you come in and stuff. And if people are committed, you get results, but they have to commit to it. They have to be committed. And once they come, and they will know they're not. I will know they're not, and I wouldn't push them off, but they will know they're not. And they probably will decide to go do something else, like fishing or play golf or run for the local council or whatever. Yeah.
So my penultimate question is with editing Weighted Words and Sanctuary, so what was the process like of editing Weighted Words and Sanctuary? I assume it was very different. And I'll make it a double barrel question as well. And in your experience editing books, is the process different with every book?
The fundamentals remain the same, and I sort of indicated when I was giving examples earlier. The fundamentals remain the same, and the fundamentals are more to do with this language, and it doesn't mean the English language. We have poems written, for example, there's one which I love, it's written in Jamaican, for example, but it's to do with it's language in the sense of is the writer saying what he or she intends to say, and then you will clarify that with them. Okay, what are you saying here? Because it's not clear to me, and then they may say, well, what I'm aiming at is X, Y, or Z, and I'll say, well, okay, but shall we look at a more effective way of saying this? So that's the kind of one-to-one thing exchange that I have with them. But I mean, as an editor, what you keep in mind is the quality of the work that you want. That's really important. It's a kind of guard railing, you say, well, this is the level of work that I want. I want work that represent these writers, that represent people, tree press, because as a press, we are known for quality work. So it doesn't mean that because somebody, has decided to do this, as a casual sort of hobby thing, that they're going to give sloppy work. It wouldn't work that way. Well, I personally wouldn't have it. So that, I want the best possible work that they can produce. And then, so what we will do is when the work comes in, I would read it. I read through every piece, And then I select, I select the ones which I think are really good. The writer may give me five poems, for example. But another poem, there are three which I think are resonant, interesting, and in a way would fit nicely within the book. It's a fresh perspective that the writer is bringing to and I will kind of leave that aside. And as they come in, I'll read through them, I'll edit them, I'll make notes on the paper on the document, and they can send it to me anytime of day or night. It doesn't matter. I get up in the morning and just look through to see what comes in, and I would read through them. I would mark them up. Sometimes they don't hear from me for a week or so because I'm thinking through what they've written. And a very good way to know when work is interesting or resonant is how much of it do I remember? How much of it has stuck with me? That's a lovely little parameter I use at times as well. And then what I do then, and that some of them I would work with on an ongoing basis because they need they need more support. So I would meet once every month or two, or once every, or meet when they feel they want to meet. We set a time aside. And just when you putting when putting the whole book together, then I have a series of intensive workshops which are scheduled. So I'd meet 2 or 3 a day. And I would go through their work with them. I'd edit the work and give it to them and say, this is what I need you to do. I need more of this, I don't think that this bit works, whatever. So we do that. We negotiate, we discuss. I explain why some things don't work or some things won't work, and then I send them back with it, and I give them a deadline to send it to me, and then they do, and I go through it again, and I say, okay, this is fine, but this isn't. Send it back again. A lot of toing and froing, and when it's done, we send them the proof of the whole book, so now of their stories, so they can see what it looks like. You know. Very few. I don't have any fights. Well, I have had a couple, but yeah, I had a couple of fights. Not major, but they always eventually get to see the light. They get to understand what I mean.
Thanks for breaking that down, Jacob. And my final question, I guess, is for the people who watch this. What advice would you give, people who are interested in writing, want to break into writing? You mentioned commitment,
Yeah,
as something that's important.
yeah. Commitment is obviously, commitment is important. But one of the things I say is, it's my motto, so to speak. Writers read. And one of the clever, I mean, my first book, not my first book, my first book to get published here by a major publisher. The editor called me in and for very particular reasons wanted to see first of all, to meet and to make contact. They had already accepted the book. Secondly, to find out if I'm a difficult person to work with, probably, the kind of person I am. And the third thing is to understand if there's mileage in this writer, is this a one-off or, So the first question that I remember that the editor asking me is, what are you reading now? Right? That's a very interesting question. And I thought about it a long time afterwards. And what asked me is, do you read? Because writers read, there's hardly a novel that's out now that doesn't have what I refer to as an intertext. You have the sense that this writer is writing within a context, and they may not even know it or be aware of it. But every book that we read either is similar to or very different from other books within the genre or whatever. Yeah, and as an editor, certainly, one becomes aware of that. And the book that stands out is the book that either breaks these rules or does something clever with these. Is like what Picasso says. He says, study the rules like a pro and break them like an artist. And you want to know whether or not the reader is breaking So that's what I do. That's a lot of it is to do with looking at what people do. So I would say to somebody who wants to read, especially the genre or the area of writing that you're interested in, it will help enormously. First of all, the most important um, element is that so that you don't find yourself repeating what somebody else has gone and done before. Yeah. And there's a kind of arrogance you get from some writers who feel, well, I am God. It comes from me, therefore it has to be good. No, because the first thing as an editor you look for is a book that has something that's different, that makes it stand out. And if it's like every other book, because the author doesn't even know that, then and that's me just kind of talking around it. But another thing that's important is persistence, not giving up, because there are times when every single one of us experiences that. It's not only about writing, it's not only with writing, but sometimes you're doing something that's important, be it studying for a degree or whatever you're doing, or trying to get something sorted and stuff. And at times you just want to give up, or you just feel you get scared of it. Writing is also about persistence. It's about sticking with it. It's about taking breaks. Writing is also about not writing at times, but thinking about what you're doing, taking walks if that's what, if you're able-bodied. If not, but find something that distracts you from the work and so on. But always with the view or with the intention to return to it. Writers, perhaps the most valuable advice that writers can benefit from is not giving up, persisting, sticking. And of course, it's tied in with self-belief. It's to do with believing I can, believing in oneself. And that's a difficult thing to negotiate sometimes, self-belief it could be a bit of a challenge for us as writers. Um, and read, as I said, read what other people are doing in the genre. One, so that you can talk about your own book, you can articulate, have a sense of what you have done as a writer, what you have achieved, and um, you know, let's assume that you become your work becomes recognized, and you sit at an interview, you get asked these kinds of questions. And it's good to be able to compare your work with somebody else's work. Say, well, my book, it has these elements, it's a bit like Kurumasami or whatever, and do that kind of intertextual thing, because that makes your conversation and makes your book richer as a consequence. That's the best I can do.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jacob.
It's a
Great
pleasure.